I've always been fond of Deerclops, the first and most iconic giant clay created for this franchise. The bone-chilling moan on a cold winter night, the screen shaking with the force of his footfalls as he approaches, his massive form looming over the player and any other mob the player has seen until this moment, even the towering tree guard and the sinister Spider Queen. It's such a well-designed setup for a fight that, for new players facing him alone, will almost certainly mean the end of their run. Deerclops acts as a threshold guardian to separate the don't starve wheat from the chaff. He tests how well you've learned to deal with the game's fundamental mechanics like insanity, kiting, proper use of armor and healing, darkness, and the winter cold. Those with the knowledge and skill to deal with him have proven that they might just have what it takes to survive indefinitely in this world. But even after your skills have reached the point where Deerclops is less of an awe-inspiring titanic threat and more of an annual annoyance, he still has the potential to cause a lot of chaos if you aren't careful. I know lots of folks who've had that one fight with Klaus that was almost over when suddenly Deerclops showed up and killed the gem deer and raging Klaus and snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Good times. A couple months ago I started playing a lot on a cooperative public server hosted by Jazzy of Jazzy's Games, and among my other contributions to the group survival effort, I made it my job to announce the exact date and time that Deerclops would spawn every winter, so that no one would be caught off guard. Some folks were curious how I was doing this, so I thought it would be a good idea to put it all up in a video. The mechanics are a little involved though, so bear with me. This guide is going to assume a world with default settings, autumn start, 15-day winters, 70-day years, etc. Giants can't spawn during the first 27 days of the world, which is why Berger never appears during the first autumn. But starting on the morning of day 28, Deerclops' spawn timer begins, set at 2.8 days. This usually leads to the first Deerclops of the game spawning late at night on day 30, as many of you probably know from experience already. When 1 minute is left until spawn, Deerclops will pick a random player on the surface of the mainland and start his trademark moan. If no players exist on the surface of the mainland due to being in the caves or in the Survivor Select screen, Deerclops' spawn timer will pause with 1 minute left and stay that way until someone returns to his domain, at which point his moan will begin immediately to signify the start of the 1 minute countdown. If you leave the surface of the mainland after Deerclops' moan has already started, by going back into the caves, returning to Survivor Select with the Celestial Portal, or disconnecting and reconnecting to the server, his timer will be reset to 1 minute and he'll start mooning at the next available surface mainland player. You can keep resetting his timer to 1 minute from spawn indefinitely if the player he's targeting keeps ducking into the caves of the Celestial Portal, but that's obviously not the most sustainable plan. 1 minute to actually do things on the surface before needing to duck into the caves or log off or spend a moonrock idle does not a pleasant, immersive wilderness survival experience make. Now that the Return of Them update is live, Deerclops' spawn timer also has some interesting interactions with boats and the Lunar Islands, although some of them might be bugs, and I've already observed them changing a little with every hotfix. The timer doesn't pause while you're away from the mainland, but if it hits the 1 minute left mark and nobody's around for Clops to target due to being offshore, It gets reset to a fairly large value. I don't know exactly how the value is determined yet, but it usually seems to be somewhere from 5 to 16 days later. The same occurs if Deerclops has already started moaning and you allow his timer to run out while standing on a boat. Deerclops won't normally ever spawn on the Lunar Islands, but if you wait for him to start moaning at you on the mainland, then quickly move yourself to the Lunar Islands before 1 minute has elapsed, he will spawn there, which can be desirable sometimes since it basically makes his insanity aura completely harmless. In any case, once Deerclops is spawned, he'll target the closest structure to the player. If there are no structures near the player, he'll wander around aimlessly until he senses another nearby structure or mob to smash. That's probably not ideal because, whether you want to fight him yourself or just confine him to a safe area, it helps to know precisely where he is. I recommend using a cheap structure like a sign or a directional sign as bait to lure him wherever you want him to go. Signs return all of the resources used to craft them, even if Deerclops manages to break them. After this, there are 3 possible outcomes. The first is that Deerclops' lust for destruction is sated by breaking enough structures. Once this has happened, and he's lost aggro on or killed all nearby mobs, he'll wander away and despawn, resetting his timer to exactly 2.8 days, after which the process repeats itself. The second is that Deerclops fails to break enough structures to be sated, but despawns with the coming of spring. This also resets his timer to exactly 2.8 days. The third is that Deerclops is killed, whether by the player or by mobs or by the environment. This will reset Deerclops' timer to exactly 16.8 days. The timer pauses during all seasons but winter, and there are 55 days in the year that are not winter. This means that in most cases, you can predict exactly when Deerclops will spawn by adding 71.8 to the moment when he died. For example, if he spawns on day 30.8 as normal, and you kill him shortly into the morning of day 31, then next year he will respawn precisely at dawn on day 103. Of course, there is a problem here. 16.8 days is slightly longer than a full winter season, which is only 15 days. This means that if Deerclops dies very close to the end of winter, with less than 1.8 days of winter remaining, he will not spawn at all the following year, his arrival effectively rescheduled for the beginning of a winter 2 years away. This is very disappointing to anyone who hopes to farm lots of eyeballs to make Ibrellas for a large server community, or for anyone who loves the Houndius Shootius. Fortunately, there is a simple trick to ensure a visit and an eyeball from Deerclops every single year. If Deerclops is scheduled to spawn very close to the end of winter, and you fear that you will cause a clopsless winter next year, simply lure him somewhere with no structures so that he can't despawn. Then leave and return on the night before spring. When the morning comes and spring has officially begun, kill Deerclops. Because he died during spring, the timer will be tricked into thinking he despawned, and reset to 2.8 days instead of 16.8, scheduling him from the beginning of winter next year. There is one other event that can alter Deerclops' spawn timer. If you stay in the caves starting from the last night of fall, or the night of day 27, the timer will have a delayed start, adding whatever time you spent in the caves to the time that Deerclops was scheduled to spawn. Going into the caves after winter has already begun in later years will not pause the timer, however. Note that all players in the server must do this, otherwise the timer will start as normal due to the continued presence of players on the surface. And that's about it. Most of this information was my own independent discovery, but a significant part was originally uncovered by a Clay Forums regular who goes by the handle Instant Noodles, whose original post is linked in the description. Hope this was useful to you folks, whether your goal is to farm as many eyeballs as possible, avoid Deerclops interrupting you while you're in the middle of something important, or just prevent Deerclops spawning entirely. Later!